Hi, and welcome to Principles of Risk Management. My name is Alex Goldstein. I am a Canadian Certified Protection Professional. I will be speaking to you about Principles of Risk Management in three separate topics. The first topic will be to understand risk management principles. The second topic will be to understand key legislation frameworks that influence risk management decision-making in an organization. And the third will be to evaluate the scope and implication of risk management standards. So let's get right into it and into Unit 1, Principles of Risk Management. Under topic number 1, let's start looking at understanding risk management principles. So let's begin by defining risk. What is risk? And what is risk in an organizational context? And we know about financial risk, we know about personal risk. What is the risk in the context of an organization, the context of a company? What risk does a company take? Risk is a measure of exposure to an unfavorable event or factor. It is not the actual event or the factor, but rather just how the event or the factor is measured in its level of unfavorability on an organization. So, for example, the collapse of a stock market. How will that affect the share price of a company that is trading? Right? What is the risk? What is the impact to shareholder psychology? Right? If there is an accident for a trucking company where one of the vehicles gets into an accident, how will that impact the business, and what risk does it constitute to the business to trust in the company's ability to deliver goods and so forth, the safety of drivers and things like that. So risk is more like a temperature, whether it is too high or is it too low, and it's measured in levels. So you take risk high risk, you take risk at a low risk, and so it's not a thing, it's more of a measure. It's a measure of exposure. Because an event or a factor is unfavorable, organizations want to have less of the risk. So lower risk, they want to reduce risk, and they want to minimize the level of unfavorability or the impact that these factors or events have. Examples of these factors include floods, bad investments, divisive political statements, shooters or attacks against the company or the people or the property itself, changes in legislation, and many, many other factors. Really, anything you can think of that might have an unfavorable impact would carry risk. Risk management is very, very important to organizations for one main reason: their survival, their basic survival, and ability to carry on business. Organizations, just like individuals, want to survive and thrive, and they absolutely must be cognizant of risk in order to avert destabilizing, debilitating, and fatal disasters. There are many ways in which organizations can manage risk. Some hire professionals, so you have companies that have risk management people, and they deal with exactly that. They take all the risk from all levels of the company, and they figure out just how to minimize and mitigate the impact, the commitments and the activities that the company takes, and their exposure to risk by taking those activities or engaging in them and so forth. So there are some, like I said, some hire professionals to dealing with this. Others employ internal resources. So a person that does legal, that is a company's lawyer, will also act like the company's risk manager. Depending on the size and structure and line of business of the organization, either option can work as long as the outcome, like the assessment, the analysis, and the management of risk is successful. Regardless of who is tasked with managing risk for an organization, effective risk management is achieved through the following key stages. That's very important: identification, assessment, and planning. So we begin with asset identification. Which assets in the company are prone to risk? And these assets can be people, such as employees of the company or a specific department, vendors delivering goods to the organization, or contractors, right? These can be property assets, so material assets, right? We have the company's, the organization's IT network, the products that it manufactures, such as vehicles, if the company is an automotive manufacturer. You have software companies, right? Their product, that's their property. That can be prone to risk and hacking and all kinds of stuff. You have office furniture and the other, mostly physical assets. Information, very, very important, informational assets. This typically includes employee files, the company's trade secrets, coding for certain algorithms, and so forth. So information is very important. It's prone to risk, especially in a digital age, right, with cyber threats and ransomware and the brute force attack and phishing and all kinds of other types of attacks. Those can increase the vulnerability of these information assets. Would basically mean that these assets are prone to risk, to increased level of risk. And reputational assets. This is a fairly complex asset if you can consider it, if you can imagine it to be an asset. It can be the company's brand, it's the company's competitive advantage, strategic positioning in the market, stakeholder and investor confidence, and resilience to media attacks. All of those are reputational assets, and they need to be looked at. And how do we mitigate risk to these assets? How do we make sure that the company is not going to suffer reputational damage because the CEO got into some trouble personally with friends, or witnessed at a bar doing something he should not be doing, right? Especially with the company's stance on social, environmental causes, and how we maintain the company's reputation and becoming resilient to risk that comes with the company making perhaps politically or socially less favorable decisions to where it stands and what causes it supports. Once all those assets are identified, and there is a fairly complicated process for identifying those assets, or they can be very simple, just a list of paper and identify them, or you can study them depending on the size of the company and the depth of the exercise that you're undertaking to evaluate risk. Those assets, once they're identified, you can either assign dollar values to them, or in other words, to quantify what they mean to us from a purely financial perspective. Or we can assess them based on their quality and the value they bring to the organization. Some of those assets, such as the reputational assets, they don't necessarily have a dollar value, or it's going to be a bit hard to determine the dollar value unless, for example, if the CEO got in trouble in a bar, how much is it going to cost the company in media investment to get the company out of the trouble that they're about to get in, right? You can look into that, but for the most part, it's very difficult to assign dollar value to some of these assets. But some assets, such as the property assets, right, you can quantify the number of office chairs in the company, right, and how much their entire loss would cost you to replace them, right, to fix them perhaps, and so forth. Some of the dollar value of people is also fairly simple to calculate, because you know how much you pay salary to the person, you know how much benefits and health benefits and so forth, all of those things, pension and disability insurance and things like that we pay. So it's fairly easy to figure out how much they would cost you and how much, what is their replacement cost. I know it sounds a little bit inhuman, but that's kind of what it comes down to if you do want to measure risk and quantify your assets that are prone to risk. So two ways, right? Two ways: quantifiable and qualifiable. Right? Quantifiable, you assign dollar values. Quality-wise, you just figure them out based on the value that these assets bring to the organization. The next step, once we identify the asset, is to identify the type of risk that these assets are subjected to. And here we cast the research net as far and as wide as we possibly can. For example, if the company is developing a new mining operation in northern Mongolia, for example, what unfavorable factors or events might there be that would affect the construction of the mine? Well, there are quite a few, but here are some examples. So there's stakeholder risk, where the company's financial backers might suddenly decide to turn away and essentially killing the entire operation, right? Because there's no money anymore. You have security risk, where local tribes perhaps launch attacks against the mining protest for misuse of their land. And you have resource risk, where the company finds that the local labor force is not really employable or not really interested in working. And you might have safety risk. An example of this would be a mining accident, which would severely impact the value of the company that may render the mine inoperable. Once we established these risk factors, we can move on to the next step, which is the evaluation of each of these risk factors against the asset. Here we would typically assess on a numerical scale, say from 1 to 10. So taking the example of the Mongolian mine, when looking at the resourcing risk, we would study the overall level of education in the area. We would find out the number of working age adults in the area and the main industries currently operating in the area to see if there are enough parallels between mining and whatever else that the people do in northern Mongolia. We would then look at the average salaries, tribal relationships, and if people are actually free to choose whom they should work for, assuming that there are enough working adults in the area, that they belong to tribes whose chiefs decide that they should work for whom and when and where they should work. The education levels in the area average perhaps at high school diplomas, and there are enough people in the area experienced in mining operations, because there are several mines within 100 kilometers of our operation. We can evaluate the risk to be around 4.5 out of 10. That's not bad comparatively, but definitely a lot to work on to further reduce it, right? Because you may not have enough people to find who's going to work for you. So that is a resourcing risk. When we reach the point in which we start thinking about reducing risk, we essentially reach the third and final stage of the process, which is risk planning. Risk planning is when we ask ourselves, what do we do with the info we just gathered? So risk planning includes 5 methods of dealing with risk: avoidance, retention, sharing, transferring, and mitigation. Let's look at the example of resourcing risk in Mongolia in the context of risk methods. So we look at our research and decide that it's not worth opening and operating a mine in Mongolia because we will not find quality workers. This is called risk avoidance. When you decide not to pursue the operation that carries risk that you cannot resolve, it's too much risk, it's just not going to happen. Then we look at the research and decide that we will take our chances and do the best we can with the resource we do end up hiring. That is called risk retention. We retain or accept risk without doing anything else other than just carrying on with our operation. Then we get into a deal with the government of Mongolia and ask them to help us with getting labor resources for our mine in exchange for additional taxes, or maybe in exchange for nothing. Since we are providing employment for people, this is called risk sharing. In this situation, if there are not enough qualified workers, our business and the government of Mongolia and their economic plans or whatever else they have tied into this are also impacted. So essentially, we're not the only ones suffering the consequences of lack of workers, the government of Mongolia in this case, but because they are also in a way a stakeholder. We decide to hire a global human resource agency and make it their problem to provide us with qualified trained workers from anywhere in the world to this mine. This is called risk transfer because we are no longer responsible for dealing with the risk necessarily. We are responsible for how the company operates, but certainly the finding of people is not something that we are going to be responsible for specifically or directly. We look at the research and start making plans on how we address the risk ourselves. We send teams of people to engage with tribal leaders. We create very attractive salary schedules. We implement training programs for new hires. We bring in supervisors from other segments of our company to help train the new workforce. This is called risk mitigation. By doing all of those things, and probably a whole lot more, we mitigate the risk of not having enough qualified workers to operate our mine. So this is called risk mitigation. We're actually doing something. Moving into topic 2 of our principles of risk management subject here, understanding key legislation frameworks that influence risk management decisions making in an organization. So while the management of an organization risk is left by and large to the organization itself, governments at all levels recognize the importance of risk management, what it means to their citizens' health, safety, protection of public infrastructure, protection of environmental assets and natural resources, and safeguarding of national, economical, and economic and intellectual property interests. So to put it in different words or terms, governments really care about how companies manage risk. Because if the companies mismanage risk, there are consequences much larger than to those that are of the companies themselves. You have people that are sick, dying. You have the environment that is sick and also dying. You have economic collapses. You have companies that are kind of doing whatever they want and putting people and property at risk and so forth. So the government does care about this, and or normally governments do, and some do better than others. And this interest is not just in obviously thoughts and prayers. Perhaps in some countries it's still at that level, but in more advanced system countries, it's written in legislation. And there's lots and lots of legislation, and more being developed. There are laws to control risk of contamination of land and water resources, for example. There is legislation to regulate the way insurance companies conduct themselves when dealing with lost claims. Laws in place to address misuse of public property or entering army bases without permissions, and so on. You can think of so many. But no risk management related legislative framework is as robust and as prescriptive as that is related to health and safety. In most developed countries, health and safety regulations have been developed over the last 30 years. So it's quite a bit of time. And what started as people's right to receive appropriate training on equipment and what they might operate has now evolved to consider psychological health and safety, mental health, emotional well-being in the workplace, and so on. We have really come a long way. The workplace has an important bearing on health because of the multitude of hazards which exist in many working environments. Those hazards may relate to a wide array of physical, chemical, and biological agents. Many aspects are regulated. For example, the Health and Safety at Work Act and the control of substances hazardous to health regulations. While in other areas, guidance and approved codes of practice help to maintain good working practices. For example, the European Union Working Time Directive, and that's going through a lot of changes now with a post-COVID recovery and return to work and so forth. In designing effective health and safety risk management legislation, governments in developed countries typically consider 5 factors. And those are very similar to those that we discussed previously for corporations to consider. See how they're kind of aligned. We'll see that in a moment here. These factors influence health and safety risk considerations within organizations absolutely and definitely. People, equipment, material, environment, excuse me, and process. We're going to unpack them one by one. So people. The first factor that can cause a health and safety hazard is people. People's actions, whether they display them or not, have a significant impact on workplace health and safety. Therefore, actions become one of the major factors that cause health and safety hazards. People play a major role in connecting with the other four factors in their own unique way, and hence the job hazard analysis becomes crucial. It helps understand the tasks based on the process flow, which we're going to talk about in a moment. The next factor is equipment. Equipment includes, typically include tools and machines that people work with or which is located nearby people. Equipment can include fixed machinery, vehicles, material handling devices, hand tools, protective equipment, and also personal gear. Moreover, some equipment can potentially emit harmful chemicals. Certain equipment can produce physical agents such as heat, noise, vibration, or radiation during operation. Material is another factor. Material can include raw material, products, hazardous chemicals, and other substances that workers use, process, or handle. Therefore, it is important to be aware about the damage that material can cause to the property. These damages could be owing to spills, corrosions, burns, or explosions. And the environment, in the fourth factor, environment refers to all parts of a workplace. The condition of all surfaces on which people walk or where people place their things are very, very important. Unsafe or poor conditions, such as overcrowding and poor ventilation, become important. Hazards caused by physical agents, such as light, temperature, and noise, are vital to analyze. It's important to consider housekeeping hazards, such as spilled cleaning fluids when the cleaners are trying to clean and they're not really doing a good job and they have a bit of a spill, whatever else. And how does that impact the safe environment and the risk that this environment now carries? They can be inhaled, people can slip over spilled fluids and whatever, cleaning detergent and things like that. Maintenance hazards such as blocked chairs, debris on stairs, and blocked floors and exits are crucial for hazard analysis. And the last factor, the last of the five factors here that we're going to consider is process. Process considers how things are done at the workplace as a whole. It connects the previous contributors, which are people, equipment, material, and environment, all together. Process covers the hazards that may be prevalent in a workplace may be prevalent in a process between these factors as they occur. For example, not informing someone that they must complete training prior to operating a forklift and requesting to see a certification of completion prior to giving the person the keys to operate the forklift would constitute process failures, in which case the risk of an untrained driver causing an accident while incorrectly operating a forklift has not been managed effectively. And governments are serious about compliance to their legislation, whether it's the Control of Substances Hazardous to Health Act, the Health and Safety and First Aid Regulations, or in Canada, we have the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulations, or the Occupational Health and Safety Act of Ontario, which is one of the provinces in Canada. Organizations found in violation of these laws face severe penalties, including steep fines, imprisonment of those found personally responsible for causing or failing to manage the risk due to negligence, spikes in business insurance premiums, or outright denial of insurance coverage, in which case you're just not able to operate in some countries or some jurisdictions. Grueling ministry compliance audits, such as the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Labor, everybody all coming over to your workplace to inspect and investigate and see what's going on all the time. And a variety of reputational damages, including erosion of client trust, demoralization of the workforce, which would lead to departure of some of your skilled workers, etc. And so to both address these legislative risk management requirements and obviously to help itself, an organization would typically retain the services of a health and safety manager, a security manager, a compliance manager, or a combination of these three roles. Specifically to health and safety, it would be the responsibility of this role to regularly conduct the risk assessments at the workplace to determine hazards, how they would affect workers, and to propose solutions to address the risk that is involved. In an organization that is in the business of providing security guards on a contract to various buildings, this is typically performed by completing an initial health and safety checklist before guards begin working at a site in order to determine what risk exists and how to best address it. And then monthly checklists to become aware of changing risk factors in order to continue addressing the risk in perpetuity. So this is just one of those examples. In developed countries, the government does not just stop at publishing all kinds of legislation and expecting organizations to just follow them. There are mandatory education programs for supervisors and managers, for example, health and safety for supervisors, training that is provided in the province of Ontario here in Canada, which must be completed every 2 or 3 years by those responsible for the performance of work by other people. So if you have people reporting to you, you're going to be responsible for taking that course every 2 or 3 years to just brush up and get refreshed on your health and safety body of knowledge. There are health and safety associations, such as in Canada, it's the Canadian Centre of Occupational Health and Safety, membership in which and the implementation of whose programs could result in discounts or insurance premiums, which organizations typically pay. There are also enforcement authorities, such as the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board in Ontario, which handles claims of workplace injuries, mandates lost time, and establishes enforcement and audit plans against companies found in violation of health and safety principles and due care, and etc. So to summarize this, general responsibilities for governments include the enforcement of the occupation health and safety legislation, workplace inspections, incident investigations, for example, those incidents involving serious injuries or death, dissemination of information, which means sharing of information and updates, promoting of training, education, and research, and resolution of occupational health and safety disputes, where that stuff can go into trial, it can go into hearings as to whose failure was it that the employee hurt himself on the job, and so forth. And some of the legal principles that are closely associated with health and safety risk management, and really a lot of other types of risk management, not just health and safety, but we're talking here as an example, health and safety. So this is most prevalent here. Negligence, which is failure to take proper care in doing something or supervising something. Duty of care, which is the responsibility or legal obligation of a person or an organization to avoid acts or omission of those acts that could likely cause harm to others. Okay? And common law, law which arises over time and becomes precedent. In the context of health and safety, common law provisions would form the basis of legislation, identifying right from wrong. For example, if it has always been accepted that pushing a person to do a role in a dangerous environment, like where you have exposed electricity, is considered wrong because it's morally wrong, that morality becomes common law. And then you know that it should not have done, that the person or whoever supervised that worker should not have told them to go and work in dangerous conditions. That's essentially what common law is, just over time. Health and safety should be an organization's top priority when it comes to risk management. That is the bottom line of this segment of this training course. And moving into topic 3, our last topic here on this quick blitz of risk management training. Topic 3, we are going to evaluate the scope and implications of risk management standards. So there are many locally developed risk management standards, ways to assess risk, best practices, etc. We talked about some of them already. I'm going to talk about a few more, but none of them are more commonly accepted than those of the ISO, which which is the International Standardization Organization, or it's sometimes reversed, International Organization for Standardization. ISO 31000, and that's an important one, is a family of standards relating to risk management codified by the ISO, by this organization. ISO 31000 2018 provides principles and generic guidelines on managing risk faced by organizations. It seeks to provide a universally recognized paradigm for practitioners and companies employing risk management processes to replace the myriad of existing standards, methodologies, and paradigms that hitherto or before this standard differed across different industries. So you have healthcare having some standards, you have construction at another standard, accounting has a different standard. So the purpose here is to bring them all in together, codify them, and making them applicable back to all of these organizations. That's the purpose. To industries, between subject matters and regions. For this purpose, the recommendations provided in the ISO 31000 be customized to any organization in its context. So if you're building a company, if you work in a company that's large, you're looking for ways to mitigate and manage risk, then look at ISO 31000, and there you will find ways and how you can do that. ISO/TR 31004/2013, Risk Management Guidance for the Implementation of ISO 31000, IEC 31010/2019, Risk Management Assessment Techniques, ISO 31022/2020, Risk Management Guidelines for the management of legal risk. They did make a distinction here for legal, but overall it's all the same or commonly accepted. And IWA 31/2020, Guidelines on Using ISO 31000 in Management Systems. All of those are the family of ISO 31000. These are very, very important, very useful documents that you should be looking into when you're formalizing your risk management activities. Risk management process, as described in ISO 31000, can be applied to any activity, including decision-making at all levels, okay? That's their purpose, to be commonly practiced. The difference between the terms risk management framework and risk management process is described by ISO as in the following. Risk management framework, set of components that provide the foundations and organizational arrangements for designing, implementing, mentoring, reviewing, and continually improving risk management throughout the organization. Risk management process is systematic application of management policies, procedures, and practices to the activities of communication, consulting, establishing context, and identifying, analyzing, evaluating, treating, monitoring, and reviewing of risk. In other words, what ISO 31000 does is that it formalizes risk management practices, and this approach is intended to facilitate a broader adoption by companies who require an enterprise risk management standard that accommodates multiple silo-centric management systems. To sum all of this little segment up here is, while you're going to take the ISO standards and apply it in your organization, there are still, so that's not where your job ends. You then need to take that and make it more silo-centric or more applicable to your specific conduct of business and whatever you're doing in your company. Okay, so it starts to be very common across all industries. That's the ISO. When you take it back to your company, every company is different. Every company does business in the industry that is somewhat more specific, somewhat different than another company, than a competitor or a partner or whatever else in that same industry and across all industries. And so it's important to just take the ISO and then properly apply, create those processes, right? Create those processes. ISO gives the framework. you are going to have to be responsible for developing the process. And so ISO 31000 is intended for a broad stakeholder group, including executive level stakeholders, appointment holders in the enterprise risk management group, risk analysts and management officers, line managers and project managers, compliance and internal auditors, independent practitioners, and so forth. So if you are responsible for a certain function in your company, and you're not a line worker, kind of, 9 to 5 doing the same kind of routine thing, you can have a lot of good value coming out of this ISO for you. Okay? Chances are that you're going to encounter some of the principles in this ISO throughout your working career, especially if you're in a management supervisory role, because you're going to be expected in one way or another to manage risk. Management of risk works best when its principles and concepts are accepted in practice at the highest management levels of the organization. It's not enough for line managers or mid-senior level management to just do their own risk management piece independently. At the top level, the senior executives, the board of directors, must be in the same kind of mind frame to manage risk. Right? They need to be cognizant of that. A risk management policy with key objectives, funding, and commitments must be developed and updated at least annually. It must discuss the organization's general appetite for risk in pursuing business opportunities or delivering current services. Top management must sign off on this policy and then obviously communicate it down the chain of command, down the corporation. A sensible risk management policy must make key references to ISO 31000 and its associated standards. For example, in the objective of creating a real-time risk register for availability of critical IT systems at a company must align with the basic principles of creating such registers, which are described in the ISO standards. The policy must also explain how risk is measured, including how management systems or software work to quantify risk at all departments in business function and how they aggregate them together. The uniform risk criteria and evaluation metrics must therefore be developed, right? So risk can be assessed in the same way across the entire organization, whether it's in the production lines, whether it's on the acquisition line where you're buying real estate on the one hand, but you're also building electric vehicles on another, right? When you're growing cannabis, so the risk to the growth and also the risk of the expansion of your business to other jurisdictions, right? The policy must also outline key training and awareness initiatives to ensure that there is a company-wide understanding of overall risk to the company, as well as risk specific to each business line, granulated down to each position. And finally, maybe more of a recap, maybe more of a confirmation of knowledge. To manage risk, you have several ways of doing it. Number one is you avoid the risk. Avoidance means not participating in activities that could harm you. In the case of health, smoking is a good example. You would avoid smoking. Accepting or increasing the risk. It acknowledges the inevitability of certain risk. And in terms of healthcare, it could mean picking a less expensive health insurance plan that has a higher deductible rate. Mitigating or changing the likelihood of the risk. In this case, it's the loss prevention and reduction mechanism we have in place. They're used to minimize risk, but not really to eliminate. For example, if you're trying to catch people stealing tomatoes in a grocery store, you would probably deploy the services of an investigator or a mystery shopper. I would still not completely eliminate your, apple or vegetable, whatever thieves, but it will catch them. So it will mitigate the risk that is posed by these characters. And sharing the risk with another party or parties, including contracts and risk financing. Sharing risk can be applied to how employer-based benefits, for example, are often more affordable than if individual gets their own health insurance. So that in this example, the individual shares their health risks with the organization that they work for by way of negotiating advantageous health benefit plans. And that is it for Unit 1, Principles of Risk Management. Thank you very much for listening in. I hope you learned a ton, and if you have any questions, reach out and we'll be glad to help you out and identify and granulate some of the topics we just talked about. And have yourself a good rest of the day and good luck.